There were also, and this was a debate, to what extent their missionary efforts included teaching free government, free economies, education, technology, these kind of things, which is part of the justice. So they're teaching this kind of stuff too. They're setting up schools. They're teaching their political and economic system. They're teaching prosperity. They're teaching about technology. And the people there, all right, give us more. They're not being successful in converting people, but they are being successful in presenting this pro-freedom ideology. So this caused some tension among the people who are supporting the missions. Are we to continue doing this? And so they did continue doing this because, twofold argument. One is that there is a sense of God's justice that is valuable in and of itself. And there's also, well, maybe they're eventually going to convert too. So it's a little bit of both. And so some of the old traditionalists are not too happy about this. So, you know, they're imposing their own views on this. They're not imposing because they don't have a military. The U.S. did not, in the 19th century, did not send its military overseas. They came home and parked it after they won the war. They sent missionaries, and they corresponded, and they tried to create what Jefferson referred to as an empire of liberty. Now that sounds like an oxymoron. How do you create an empire of liberty? Empires generally are not conducive to liberty. And they never have been. When Rome went from a republic to an empire, liberty vanished. When the Greek city-states went from a liberty-based federation of independent city-states to what was it, the guy? Draw a blank. Anyway, they became the liberty part was lost. So, but the empire of liberty was not a liberty that was politically established by political dominion through military armies. It was an ideological empire. It was an empire of values and ideas. They succeeded in expanding an empire of liberty during the 19th century largely by winning the war of ideas. They had opposition, but the young idealistic people in the Middle East were adopting these ideas. The college students, the kind of people like a Sayyid Qutb, who was like the intellectual guru of that came to America during the late 40s, early 50s. This is the type, it became like the guru of the terrorist movement, of the Al-Qaeda movement. These type of people during the 19th century were accepting American ideology rather than accepting jihad like they are today, and there's a reason for that. So our ideas and values were expanding, and the cream of the crop in these societies were accepting them slowly. And the meeting up with the Arab slave trade redoubled the conviction to oppose the slave trade at home. And so you had not only the expansion of these ideas and values, but you had what I consider probably to be the greatest moral crusade of human history, was the international abolitionist movement. You had an abolitionist movement in America, but you had an international one too, and it was the first ones who got this rolling was the Quakers. And then from the Quakers, you had other evangelical groups that were picking up on this, and the ideas expanded. And eventually, they recruited William Wilberforce, who was the British parliamentarian, and it was the star of this movie. What was the Amazing Grace, right? And so you had this international abolitionist movement, and you also had what is referred to by some classical liberal scholars as the classical liberal world order, where the voluntary associations that we talked about earlier in our that came out of family and community were actually international. You had these voluntary associations. You had societies creating schools. You had trade organizations. They became international. And this became their goal, their vision of peace, of a peaceful world order based upon the idea of freedom. And this was expanding internationally. And there's an article about classical liberalism in the peaceful world order by Professor Richard Evelyn, who used to be a professor of economics at Hillsdale College. And he also there's a website sociologist R.J. Runnell, who is called Democratic Peace. He starts talking about how free government, democratic free government, and economic free market system is more conducive to our peace. And he gives a whole bunch of studies on this. So this was a vision that they had of peace and liberty, and they wanted to create this empire of liberty where it was not an empire by military, because they were not a military power at the time. They didn't intend to be. And they didn't believe they needed to have military overseas. There was an old saying that more powerful than an invading army is an idea whose time has come. And that the freedom was an idea whose time was come, and it was expanding, and it was gaining currency around the world. And they had people having political pilgrimages to America to study this idea. And you had people in the Middle East who wanted to follow the American example as a country that rose up from being a colonial. They rose up. They liberated themselves from being a colony of these colonial powers, and this was an example that these people wanted to follow. And so these ideas were spreading and gaining currency. And they got rid of slavery to a large start in most places. There was still colonialism. There were still colonies that needed to be liberated. But there was national independence movements that were being started that were inspired by the national independence movement in America. So the ideas were gaining currency, were spreading. And next session, we're going to talk about the conflict of visions, how this momentum of our ideology was met with an opposing vision. And eventually, this momentum was not only stopped, but turned around. And since the mid-19th century, later 19th century, you had the momentum reversed, and you had collectivism. And then into the 20th century, it took political form. It had ideological form started in the 19th century, took political form in the 20th century. But the forces of freedom, ideologically, had been on the defensive ever since. And so you had this potential for this idea of peace to be established, and it was sweeping much of the globe. But we ran into an ideological counterforce, and today we're kind of absent in the war of ideas. Absent in the war of ideas. And so, as a matter of fact, we're not even aware there's a war of ideas going on. But that's really what the central defining struggle of our civilization, world civilization, national civilization today, is this war of ideas. And we need to get back in touch with this notion, because at one point we were very well aware of it, and we were leading the struggle for a very positive sense of liberty and freedom. So this again, next week we're going to talk about what went wrong in this counterforce, and we're going to refer to it as a conflict of visions.